So for our Week 8 presentation, we examined the paper Towards an Operational Sustainability Criterion by Howarth in the year 2007. So this paper examines the concept of sustainability and the implications for environmental policy. The author attempts to answer four questions. Do present societies have a moral obligation to future generations? What does it mean to maintain opportunities from one generation to the other? What policies can achieve this goal? And when is it permissible to deplete resources and not leave them for the next generation? So some background information on this subject. The concept of sustainability is well documented throughout history. The public trust doctrine, which is old Anglo-Saxon laws, talk about how certain resources are preserved for public use, and governments must protect and maintain these resources. Thomas Jefferson wrote how that it is the duty of the living to maintain opportunities for the future. And the first head of the United States Forest Service talked about in his when creating the department that he recognizes fully the rights of present generation to use what it needs and all it needs of the natural resources now available, but also recognizes equally our obligations so to use what we need that our descendants shall not be deprived of what they need. Sustainable policy. In starting from the 1950s onwards, we've seen policies enacted to try and preserve sustainability. The United States National Environmental Policy Act says, and quote, fulfills the responsibility of each generation as trustees of the environment of the succeeding generations. Building on from this, the World Commission of Environment and Development talks about how we must present needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Sen talks about the idea of development as freedom, and that the importance of economic development and development in society is that it enhances freedom and expands, and that no development should be done that restricts freedom. Building on from this, she links the destruction of natural resources to taking away potential freedoms of the next generation. So, next is the welfare analysis. And this is where the author kind of lays out his approach to examining welfare. So, we must maintain per capita utility across periods. Any action taken should not decrease the per capita utility of the next period. Only actions that are Pareto improvements should be considered. We cannot negatively impact the joint productive potential of economic or environmental systems. So whatever happens now should not limit future production. Because of this, all decisions must be based on intergenerational fairness. Intertemporal efficiency is important, but there is no justification for imposing uncompensated costs on future generations. So then there's two ways to tackle the idea of using natural resources in the current period. We can either conserve and protect if we cannot fairly compensate the next generation, or we can fairly compensate so as we are not imposing the costs. However, there are problems with evaluating future welfare and resource needs. So the author maintains that in absence of definitively knowing what the future looks like, it is best to approach the sustainability through conserving instead of trying to compensate in the future. There are three important questions laid out in the remainder of this paper. Do future generations have well-defined rights that place restraints on short-term social, political, and economic decisions? Can questions of sustainability be reduced to maintain the utility or well-being of typical members of society? And under what circumstance do rights of future generations entail a specific duty to conserve and protect the environment? So moving on to duties to the posterity. There are three main arguments against the sustainability approach. The first being the classic utilitarian argument that issues of moral good are to be decided based on the social welfare function, and that the social welfare function is only about those currently alive. We must balance the respective interests of each member of society equally. Some people may be altruistic and want to help future generations, but action should not be taken that are detrimental to current members of society. However, there are some clear conflicts with this rights-based framework. The role of government should be to maintain liberty and improve welfare now and in the future. If you look at scholars such as Locke or even the US Constitution, it talks about how the importance is the ability to achieve one's happiness. And the aim of development should be about maximizing freedoms rather than maximizing current welfare. We should allow opportunities for people to achieve their highest amount of welfare, but we shouldn't be restricting welfare in the future to maximize current welfare now. So the second argument against it is that morals are shaped by potential threats. And so this goes from the idea that we have a mutual forbearance between members of society, and that is what derives morals. Current generations may choose to sacrifice for future generations, but this is based off love or altruism and not what is moral obligation. By definition, future generations cannot inflict harm or help current members of society, and so we do not have a moral duty to them. However, there are clear problems with this line of thinking. If morals are based on avoiding potential harm, then it would be possible to inflict suffering on children or others who cannot harm or aid you. Additionally, the right action should be one that entails the protection of the powerless from the powerful is a pretty agreed upon approach. The final argument comes from the authors Howarth and Parfait, and this argument is based on the idea that present actions impact future welfare and the identities of future humans. So changes to quality of life impact behavior and decision making, which may change which pair of gametes come together to create the next generation. Therefore, future generations should just be happy to exist at all if their lives are worth living at a minimum, and should not have expectations of past generations and try and have equal quality of life between the two. The counter-argument to this is clear, and it's the idea that current generations have undeniable obligations to their currently living children and grandchildren. And so, building off this, the author talks about this idea of a multi-generational chain of obligations. What exactly do we owe the living and the unborn generation? All members of society should be able to enjoy a similar set of fundamental freedoms. A rational person would never choose an arrangement that arbitrarily places them at a disadvantage, so the standard must be high to get consent from everybody in society. Since generations overlap, each generation holds a duty to pass on an undiminished amount of life opportunities. This is different to the intergenerational private obligations of a family. This is just a bare minimum that should be maintained across society. To exploit one power and deplete shared resources for private profit is to deny somebody in the future's full moral standing. So then each generation then holds the duty to pass on an undiminished life opportunities to the next generation and that generation must pass on the same opportunities to the subsequent. This formation from the present to the long run in the distant future.
Sustainability as non-declining utility. So the next section of this paper begins by explaining the paper's basic idea behind defining sustainability. Howarth says that society is considered sustainable if it maintains the quality of human life opportunities from each generation to the next. This basic idea gives us the framework on which he will build his ideas for the remainder of this section. From here, he states the importance and difficulty in accurately quantifying life opportunities in the present and the future. He first points to Pezzi and Solo's research, stating that sustainability can be defined in terms of maintaining a certain utility level for a typical member of society. They argued that people's utility levels give a measure of the quality of life opportunities that were afforded to them due to the fact that people are rational decision makers in a liberal society. Next, Howarth once again looks to Solo's work to highlight the idea that produced goods can be adequate substitutes for natural capital when attempting to maintain per capita utility over many generations. He argues that the social costs of resource depletion can be completely offset by increased investment in manufactured capital or in the development of new technologies. So an example of this would be the development of wind turbines or solar panels as energy sources to offset the depletion of naturally occurring products such as the oil and gas reserves. The idea that produced goods are effective substitutes for natural capital in all cases is a bold claim, which Solo has been quoted explaining with, "I doubt that I would feel myself better off if I had found the world exactly as the Iroquois had left it." In this, he was trying to convey his idea that people, although it's important to know not all people, have benefited from the development of urban environments. So he was also suggesting that utility is linked more so to the total productive capacity of the economy rather than natural resources specifically. And then, so our previous slide introduced the idea of produced goods as substitutes for natural goods. So this slide shows how this idea could be put into practice. A natural idea would be to use a cardinal utility index that is valid across time. And this just means that we would be able to derive the utility value that a person receives from obtaining different goods and services. This would mean that economic welfare would be directly observed and given a monetary value. Clearly, this method has its challenges, and economists are wary of the standardization of such a metric and its viability in assessing utility accurately for different people and different generations. A person may have very highly valued a horse in the 1800s, as it was a common method of transportation, and thus it would have received a high utility value. But in the present day, obviously a car would be a much better option, and so people would likely derive a higher utility for it than a horse. However, if the index had hypothetically been created in the 1800s, they likely would have never imagined a car, and so it would not have utility value in the index, rendering it difficult to accurately assign a comparatively fair utility value. So this example just shows that predicting the welfare of future generations is uncertain and potentially speculative. The idea that preferences are not fixed over multi-generational timescales also speaks to Pessy's idea of hedonic treadmill. So this states that the habituation of economic growth could alter preferences so that infinitely increasing consumption levels are required to sustain a constant level of well-being over time. And oh goodness, there we go. And this has proved to be true in places like the US, Europe, and Japan, where survey data has shown that large increases in material prosperity since World War II has only created very small improvements in people's life satisfaction. So this actually illustrates the walking on the treadmill metaphor, so always an uphill battle, but never actually getting anywhere. And then a potential solution to the challenges we mentioned on the previous slide is derived from the work of John Hartwick. It's the net investment rule that states that a dynamic economy will maintain a constant or increasing level of per capita utility only if investments in manufactured capital exceed the monetary value of natural resource depletion on an economy-wide basis. Under this idea, we could calculate the monetary value of resource depletion by multiplying that year-to-year change in a certain resource by society's willingness to pay for that resource. And then from there, we can ensure that minimally that amount is being invested in manufactured capital or the development of new technologies. So the intuition behind that is that if $1 worth of manufactured capital can provide services that fully replace those lost by $1 less of natural resources. So it's important to know, however, that this solution is only viable under three very stringent assumptions. First, that population, technology, and preferences must be held constant. Second, that the economy must be closed or terms of trade must be held constant. And third, that resources must be allocated in a perfectly efficient manner under conditions of perfect foresight. So from these, we can clearly see that although this solution looks good in theory, it's extremely difficult to apply it accurately to real-world scenarios. For example, we know that over time, it's unlikely that population growth would be zero. So if we use this net investment rule, we would actually get an understated rate of capital investment needed to maintain per capita utility. So the only way to apply this method to the real world would be to forecast the course of the economy's future development over a large time period, and this we know is often an impossibly imprecise task.
Sustaining opportunities. Previously, we discussed the challenges involved with creating comprehensive, forward-looking indicators of human well-being. However, this doesn't suggest that the concept of sustainability cannot be operationalized. Sen's development as freedom suggests that public policies should aim to maintain and enhance people's effective life opportunities. There's a strong focus on improving livelihood in developing countries, but life opportunities should be understood in terms of a broad set of factors, being political freedoms, economic facilities, social opportunities, transparency guarantees, and protective security. They should each be improved in societies which aim to achieve meaningful development. However, this doesn't directly apply to environmental conservation. Sen, in the opening page of his book, identifies worsening threats to our environment and to the sustainability of our economic and social lives as deprivations that negatively affect the well-being in both industrialized and developing nations, which is how we apply it to environmental conservation. Consistent with Sen's general approach and the writings of Thomas Jefferson, the fair sharing principle, ceteris paribus, each member of present and future society is entitled to share fairly the benefits derived from environmental resources. Specific stocks of environmental resources should not be depleted without rendering just compensation to members of future generations. Natural resources are joint property or patrimony of present and future generations under this principle, and compensation must be understood in terms of explicit payments for the opportunity costs imposed by resource depletion. In practice, this can be through either the provision of adequate replacement technologies or through financial payments transmitted through means of durable institutions stretching over multi-generational timescales. This doesn't focus on maintaining average income levels or the value of stocks from each generation to the next. Instead, specific individuals harmed by resource depletion must be compensated for the specific infringements imposed on their just entitlements. The fair sharing principle is related to the concept of safe minimum standards in resource economics and strong sustainability in ecological economics, and it favors research conservation in the face of uncertainty. This also leaves room for considerations of economic efficiency and cost-benefit analysis, provided the costs and benefits are well-defined and the steps taken to compensate individuals and groups who are specifically harmed by environmental degradation. Criticisms, such as Solo, is that providing future generations with an ex-ante entitlement to natural resources runs the risk of locking up resources in a manner that would impair economic efficiency and forestall the improvement of living standards over time. A potential solution. If there are concerns about sustainability, they must impose two major qualifications. The costs and benefits that resource depletion would impose on future generations must be established with a reasonable degree of confidence. Additionally, members of future generations must receive full compensation for the costs imposed by resource depletion. Endorses the pursuit of intergenerational Pareto improvements relative to the baseline that would arise given a full and literal protection of future generations' ex-ante rights to enjoy the benefits of undiminished natural environments. To conclude, the author outlines three main arguments in the paper. Firstly, members of future generations are morally entitled to enjoy life opportunities that are at least as good as those enjoyed today, from the idea that equal opportunities should be provided to each member of society, and this brings up the concept of intergenerational fairness. Secondly, life opportunities would be sustained if the utility of a typical member of society was maintained over intergenerational timescales, but gouging future utility brings up theoretical and imperial barriers. And short and medium-run forecasting models frequently fail to anticipate important developments on the economy and society. Thirdly, maintaining life opportunities can be achieved by providing future generations with a structured bequest package in which a variety of items, manufactured capital, technology, capacity, environmental resources, and the integrity of political and social institutions are maintained over time, which brings up the fair sharing principle, where economic resources are common property of each member of present and future society. And if resource depletion or environmental degradation occurs, there is a duty to compensate members of future generations.